Hello, welcome to Quackalope. Thank you for being here. Today I wanted to take some time to have a conversation with you about storytelling. Now, anyone that has been a fan of the channel for some time now probably has come to realize that storytelling, flavor text, narration, lore, any of those elements are things that I pay a lot of attention to. Whether it's in a RPG game specifically, or in a board game that is kind of supplementing it or has it as the flavor or the context that you're playing in. And so I thought I would take the time today to talk about 5 elements or 5 things that I've learned over the years about the way that I tell stories. Now, not all of these will apply to you, but some of them might be curious, some of them might be helpful, and they are the ways that I approach telling a narrative, specifically within the context of an RPG game, as a DM, because running a campaign is hands down probably my favorite thing to do. So I thought I'd dig into that. Now, before we get too far into this video, I do want to go ahead and thank our sponsor, which is going to be the Deck of Many, who are currently in their final days for their new Kickstarter around the deck of animated spells. Now, they are the sponsor for this video, but that doesn't mean that we accepted a contract. Instead, because this is one of the very first videos on the channel, which has sponsored content alongside maybe a conversational tone, I asked for them to give me a few decks of cards and a few rule books and things to give out to my Patreon community, and I said I'd make a few videos talking about my love and my experience around RPG games. And so that is exactly what we're doing. Now, the reason I feel comfortable doing that is because I am a massive fan of their product. Their spell cards are animated spell cards with 8 frames each that absolutely transform your gameplay experience. When I first got into RPG games or D&D games, I literally went out and bought as much as I could to supplement my player's experience. I did custom printed business card size, like gear and spells and money and resources. I had the whiteboard with the hex grid so we could draw on and adapt. I had little notebooks that I handed out to every single player the first time they arrived. I wanted to do it right. I wanted to help make it easy for players to not only enjoy the campaign, get into the story, but also physically and tangibly interact with and experience what we were doing. Right? All these little things help them immerse themselves into the campaign that we're running. Instead of dealing with logistics and numbers, we got to sit down and tell a story together. And if I'd known about the Deck of Many, or the Deck of Many animated spells before I'd started running my campaign, I would have went out of my way to pick up all of them. Because they are absolutely fantastic. They're not only made out of a nice plastic, they have all your reference material that you need on the back of them, for different types of spells, casting, conditions, everything you'd find within the D&D rulebook. But they also have so much movement and transformation on the top of the cards that you can actually see and kind of witness a spell that's happening. So I'm a massive fan. That is my aside. A shout out to a company that I admire, a product that I personally use and love, for a Kickstarter that is currently running. And like I said, just a reminder, the only thing we asked from the Deck of Many was to give us a few of their products to give away to our Patreon community, because I just genuinely love the work they do. So, that being said, let's go ahead and swing into this video. I want to talk about storytelling. I want to talk about my experience with storytelling, the way I approach storytelling, both from a RPG DM side of things, but then that is also the thing that kind of trickles into the way I write, the way I visualize and play games, and the way I do some of our narrative gameplay, because in a lot of ways I am running those games and talking through those games as if I am a DM. There's no way for me to script or predict what is going to happen within the context of a board game. Instead, I take the conditions with which I'm given and I adapt or twist or visualize them in a way that allows me to apply them to a story, and try, if I can, as much as I can, to keep a cohesive narrative thread throughout that story. So, I'm going to have 5 points I want to go over, and I'll do my best to break them down into little subsections to give you a sense of what we're talking about. I want to talk about the fact that storytelling, as the DM, is, in fact, the game. That's the way I visualize it. That's the way I approach it. And I want to dive into that a little bit. I then want to talk about the idea of creating modules that are flexible. Different story elements that exist in the world you're playing in, but don't have to be locked into a singular location. This gives you flexibility when it comes to adapting to and reacting to what happens on the game state, because anyone that has played in or ran or watched or experienced an RPG game knows one of the biggest challenges is just effectively reacting to how chaotic a group of humans coming together to tell a story can be. And so I want to talk about creating modules that allow you to define a play area, that give you flexibility. Then I want to talk about keeping the world moving, understanding the context with which you're playing the game in, and making sure that things progress along based off of how long or what your characters are doing. Little actions, little bits and pieces will react with the rest of the world, and that'll make them feel like they're living in and connected to a living space. That is a big part of immersing people into a campaign, reminding them that their actions actually have consequences and they matter. And then finally, I want to talk about the idea of listening to and then adapting to your players. Not only being willing to hear what they're interested in, what they have to say, but then being willing and able to adjust both in your preparedness and then also on the fly to the type of feedback they give you. So, that is the setup for this video. That is the concept. I will mostly spend this time talking with you and rambling and doing my best to explain my thoughts or the way that I approach this, in the hopes that my ideas around storytelling, the things that I've learned work for me, will maybe shed some light on things that you've been trying to figure out. And then I also hope that in the comment section down below, you will take the time to share those ideas with me, the things that you've applied, the stuff that maybe I haven't thought of either. Or pose questions, like if you want something dug into a little bit, let me know. I'll do my best to respond and let you know my thoughts or my approach. So to start with the top point, the idea that storytelling is the game itself. This really applies to why, for me, being the DM, being the storyteller, the person that is the driving force, is the most interesting and exciting part of, really, gameplay across the board. There's nothing more than I love sitting down in the conductor's seat, watching this narrative tale twist and turn and bend, and being able to thread it and make a cohesive and conductive environment for players to both immerse themselves and enjoy or experience the game. And there's a lot of elements that go into this. There's a lot of study and research and prep that I put into playing that game, but the first step for me in being a DM was starting to realize, or really starting to dig into the fact that that in itself is the game that I like to play. And so if you're learning to be a new DM, if you're trying to figure out how you can approach storytelling, do so in a way that allows you to enjoy it. As a puzzle that you're trying to solve, as a game you're trying to play. You're not just the person that has to sit out and make sure other people have fun. It is the wrong way to approach being the DM. And if you are that type of person, maybe DMing isn't the best step for you. But if you want to run a game, if you want to facilitate fun for your friends, you have to make sure you're able to have fun at the same time. And for me, that was just having it click that the game I was playing was different but very similar to the game they were playing as well. I am doing my best to weave a narrative, to find and put together all of these puzzle pieces that somehow tell a captivating and realistic story within the space of the table. Taking the imaginations of 4 or 5 other players, or in a smaller group possibly, but taking the imagination of another player and conforming it, maybe conforming is not quite the right word, but instructing it in a way that acknowledges that imagination exists, that celebrates the fact that it is there, and that places it within a context or an environment where that imagination can take hold and can thrive. So, that is my first point. And hopefully that made sense. Hopefully, if you haven't thought about DMing or thought about storytelling as a game in itself, I've given you some elements to think on. Now, the second thing that I want to talk about, and this is going to go into how I wrangle and approach preparation for a D&D game. And that's going to be creating modules that are flexible based on what the players do. So a lot of these books over here, even the starter set that I have here, they give you the resources necessary to understand the world, the lore, the mechanics, the structure of the game, but you still have to be prepared for your characters, your players, to run things off the rails. That is just how collaborative RPG or imaginative experiences work. And so, as you're working through a story or creating your own custom campaign, or even sitting there listening to your players play in the middle of a heated environment, you should be ready and able to shift elements of your story around in a way that makes it, or the way that genuinely is, flexible and allows your players the leverage or the leniency to go and do whatever they would like, for the most part, but still moves them down the road that progresses the story. Because we are telling a story. Now, that story can shift and change in wild ways depending on your group and what they decide to pursue. So you should be ready to change the narrative and change literally everything that's happening. But you should always be working to a resolution or to a crescendo or to a main narrative, even if that main narrative starts to change or adapt as people play. And so there's some ways that you can do this. First off, there are some modules that put people in an environment where it is hard for them to go off the rails. Now, they still will find ways to do it, but for instance, a cavern or a dungeon or a keep really becomes a limited environment. So in a dungeon, I might have pathways I can go down. I might have ways that I can adapt to the environment, whether or not I climb on top of barrels or duck underneath the water. But I'm not able to, let's say, turn around and leave the cave and go to a city. Well, you might be. And depending on who's running the game and who's playing the game, that might still happen. But for the most part, in those self-contained environments, you will want to have things that are adaptive for the rooms, and you'll want to be able and willing to listen and kind of be ready to play with the players as they explore those environments. But you're able to kind of keep them in a controlled space a little bit more. Now, some of the adaptability you can do within a module like a cave or a cavern would be to have elements that resolve in various ways or things that can happen that all lead, kind of continue progressing the story. So they could fall into the river, which is going to rush them downhill and drop them into a cavern, which is kind of the cavern they were going to. Maybe they're disadvantaged, but they're still in the direction that you were trying to bring them. Maybe if they go around the side tunnel and find a secret passage, they can find a stairway that brings them to the same type of room, but this allows them to explore the space in a different way and maybe gives them advantage on the environment or the party that they were trying to witness. You see, so there's probably a few different pathways or approaches that they could take to get from point A to point B, or point A to point F. But along the way, you should have elements that you could sub in, answers to questions that they pose or answers to things that they do that allow you to adapt. Now imagine that you're walking through a forest, for instance. Mist starts flowing in and you can't quite see where you're going. You have some options. You can hear a sound off into the distance. You can see the path that you've been traveling on extending both in front of you towards a wide mountain range and behind you back to the city and the village that you came from. And then you see a figure kind of skirt off into the fog. Or maybe it wasn't a figure. Maybe it was just a reflex of your imagination. You're not sure. So I've just posed 4 story hooks to the characters that are playing the game, to you. I have path behind you, path in front of you, sound coming off to your right, and a visage or a figure or some sort of manifestation in the mist coming off to your left. And now I give you the opportunity to explore. But let's say the end goal is to always move you a little bit closer to the mountain range. Well, if you turn around and go back to the village, maybe you're prepping. Maybe you're stockpiling, maybe you come across a trader on the road who talks to you or tells you more about the thing that you're hunting, gives you a little bit more information, right? So that's an encounter. If you cut off to the side of the woods, maybe you find another tribe of creatures or beings. Maybe there's some hidden, lost kind of gems or resources. Maybe there's a keep over there that gives you a map or gives you items that you need in order to progress to the mountain range. Maybe you get lost in the woods and you find yourself unable to orient. And so doing something like climbing a tree will give you bearing, but the only bearing that you really have is a vast plain of forest and then that mountain that you're going after. So still directing you or kind of helping you get there. Maybe you've cut off to the side, the mist envelops you. You find yourself trapped and facing a series of obstacles and events, and you're spun out or spit out of the mist in a valley, standing now in the middle of kind of this forgotten peak. Or if you continue progressing forward, maybe you approach it like normal, stepping forward, walking, continuing the story in that way. Maybe you find a small hut down the pathway, or you come to the base of the mountain, you're able to talk with the local traders in the local village and prepare yourself for what awaits. Now, you don't want to keep your players on a railroad, meaning that if they directly divert and indicate that they're not interested in pursuing the story that you've presented to them, the narrative hook, you want to give them opportunities to explore other narrative hooks. The visage in the fog doesn't have to be tied to the mountain. Instead, it could be its own problem they have to solve on the way to that final story. Or the hut, or the village that is over and behind them. Maybe there's other things that civilians need them to do. Maybe they go to the local bar and they get in a scrappy match. Maybe they head out on a pirate ship and your story starts to adapt or change, and the overarching or the main element, the bad guy, kind of the narrative that they're pursuing, whatever they are after, remains true, but the environments in the world shift. So that's one element to storytelling, making it modular. But then the other element to storytelling around creating modular pieces that can fit in is going to do with the environments and the encounters that you can come across. So I'll jot down characters that live in this world, whether it's an old hag pushing a shopping cart, people you can find in the village, potential animals or beasts that you can discover along the way, and I'll have a pile of those prepared, both for me to randomly draw from or on hand in case my party, my adventuring party, does something that needs an answer. They jump off into the woods, and I then need to either have a tribe of people or have a lost wanderer prepared, or I need to maybe have an encounter with some forest creatures. Maybe they turn back to the village, and on the road I have one or two traders or humans that they could encounter, people that they might have seen earlier on in the adventure, or potentially someone brand new who's coming up the path kind of following them or after them. All of these little bits, the prep that you do that doesn't lock someone into a railroaded story, but instead gives you items you can play with and experience with, and bits and pieces to the world so that you know it inside and out, so that you know it better, allow you to adapt more effectively and efficiently when players do things that you don't expect. So that is what I'm trying to communicate when it comes to modularity. Now, along with that, part of it that has to do with knowing the world that you're playing in is going to be keeping that world moving. So as you're forming or understanding a campaign, if you're diving into the mines here and you come to the village or you're downstairs and people are, you're in the caverns and you're making a ton of noise and goblins and orcs can hear and react, you don't want to keep everything locked into place as your heroes progress through the story. Like they're stumbling in, and the only time moves forward is when they are directly in relation to it. For me, that makes the game feel stagnant. It means the world is on pause until your heroes show up. Instead, I find it much more interesting or compelling to have the world shift and adapt and be moving around them. So you should have a sense of not only what your players are doing, but what that means in the context of a wider space. Does hunting down and killing a bear result in maybe a traitor following after you, looking for the bear fur? Maybe there was a hunter who had been pursuing that same creature. Maybe there's a reward when you get back to the town that you didn't even know about. But because you've accomplished this task, maybe there's something you can get for that. Is there a chance that the time that you've spent going off into the mist pursuing this other side quest, in that time, the villain of your story is no longer waiting at the top of the mountain range. Instead, you've missed them by a day or two. They've already ransacked the village. They've already stolen the pendant that you were looking for. Maybe they got into the temple while you weren't there. And so when you arrive, that environment has changed, but also the narrative that your NPCs are talking about has also changed. They're now telling you a story about how he was just here, how he took something precious, how they destroyed and burned and ransacked the village, and if only you'd been there a minute earlier, a day earlier, you would have been able to fight them, or prevent it, or at least help. So I try to have a sense of the global world we're playing in, a zoom out from the heroes who are adventuring, and in my mind, I try to keep all of those little elements moving and flowing as we play the game. If you accidentally release something horrific into the world, well, that isn't just an evil you need to deal with. There are consequences to your actions, to the things you've done, whether they're on purpose or by accident. And your villagers, your NPCs, your tribes will and should react to you in according to the history that you've had, the impact that you've had on the world, because you are changing things. And time is moving forward. And so if you are well known for being a hero or a villain, or there are creatures that are antagonistic to you, or maybe have heard rumors of you coming, then that should all adapt and change right alongside you. If the villain is spreading rumors, then those rumors should have a pace, a life to their own. If he is causing trouble, then that trouble, just like I've said, should start to spin out of control and spiral. And if you don't address it, if you don't deal with it as the players, then the world will become more and more chaotic and uncontrollable. So those two elements, having modular systems, having an understanding of what could exist in the world, and the availability to bring those pieces into gameplay when your characters react, but then also having something along the lines of just a sense of the space and time within which you're playing. Those two elements will allow you to create a living and breathing and hopefully immersive environment, maybe a sandbox in a way for your players to experience themselves in. I dropped a duck. So, along with that, the next two things that I want to touch on are going to be dealing with the players themselves, the people who are sitting down and playing the game with you. You need to be able to listen and then adapt to your players. I've tried to set this up as if I'm understanding and creating a world for players to exist in. And there is usually an overarching story or an overarching narrative you're trying to explore. That is part of the collaborative like D&D or RPG experience, is getting to the end of the tale, right? Being the heroes, becoming who you were meant to be. However, players, like I've said, will not only change and adapt that narrative, but potentially even flip it entirely on its head. And that is okay. One of the most uncomfortable things that players experience when diving into an RPG game is a DM who railroads the story, who hasn't taken the time to understand that this is a living and breathing environment, who doesn't have context for, the different opportunities, the different NPCs, the personalities that exist in the game, the potential for the time and the movement and the environment to change as your characters do. Things should grow with them. And they railroad them. They stick them on a single pathway, a single narrative. You have to do this. You have to get there. If you turn around, instead of having an NPC that shows up and gives them more information or encourages them to move towards the mountain or potentially redirects them to an entirely different path, you have someone that comes up and just says, oh, you can't go that way. You have to move forward. Or they branch off into the woods and they suddenly find themselves exactly where you were intending them to be, and it is entirely clear that they had no control over that journey. That is what's called railroading. And that becomes very unfun, because you're taking away agency from the players. People who are playing within your game should have the ability to do and say and be everything that their characters are. Now, that doesn't mean they control your world or your environment, but they certainly help script and inform it. They are a part of it, after all. And the world is reacting to them. You're playing the role of the DM. This is a game you're playing with them. You're not conducting them on a story or forcing them through a narrative. Instead, this is a collaborative process where you're helping them journey through and experience whatever it is they're looking for. And so you need to be able to listen to them, both in and out of the game, to what they're excited to explore. Listen to the characters' backstories. Encourage them to spin a narrative or tell a tale right alongside of yours. Understand and build into your game what they are after. What not only the player, but the player, the hero, the character that they're playing. What they're interested in, where their passions are, who their enemies might be. All of those should go to build the campaign that you're creating. If you have a bard whose greatest desire is to be the greatest songwriter in history, it's not going to do you any good to not include instruments or an audience or an opportunity for them to pursue that. If you have a druid who wants to become a chef, then collecting ingredients, exploring vast parts of the world, hearing rumors of recipes and famed people in the chef scene should be something that you lean into. They should be able to gain and learn and explore their own sub-narratives, their side quests, alongside of your major story. And if they decide that their side quests should be the main plot and the rest of the group moves in that direction with them, then your main story might in fact become a second thought. It might become a side quest while you spend the time exploring their character arc above and beyond your own. So take the time necessary to listen to your players. Try to understand what their motivations and their desires are, and then adapt. Now, adaptation can be done in two very important forums. First off, you have adaptation when it comes to preparing for the game. That goes into building the modules that I was talking about, but also it should come into building and understanding and knowing your resources enough to be able to think on the fly. Preparation is going to be key to running a good D&D campaign. Being a DM is all about having a sense of the world and the space. And so when it comes to storytelling for me and preparing to adapt on the fly to the storytelling, I should know the world and the environment enough that I can tell you without a second thought what might happen in this space, what this character's reaction would be, who might exist in this village when you show up. And so that's a big part of it. Studying so you can adapt, studying so you know the world, and really, really immersing yourself in it and living in it. But then also adaptation when it comes to your character's decisions and actions. I think this ties to knowing the space well enough as well, but when your characters do something crazy, or something weird, or something unique, celebrate it, lean into it. There's a thing in, I think, like the acting scene that's sort of like yes and that's sort of what we're doing in this environment. You're thinking through what your player just did, saying yes to it, affirming that they're able to do that, and then you're supplementing it. Yes and. So if I am the druid who is looking for famed ingredients or famed recipes, then I might listen to them, describe the fact that they are looking for the most perfect mushroom for a soup that they're trying to prepare, something that might have healing potions or something. And so I respond along the lines of, yes, and you know exactly where that is. In the caverns down in the middle of the forest, you've heard rumor of this mushroom growing, a fungal kind of green algae substance that spreads in the darkest parts of the cavern where sunlight can't hit. And so they now know a little bit more information. They know where they might need to explore, and they can progress in that way. So you should be willing to listen and adapt or adjust based off of what your characters... So you should be able to listen and then adapt or adjust your storytelling, your environment, to whatever the players are giving you. This is, at the end of the day, a collaborative storytelling process. It is an experiment. And so you're doing your very best to hear what they say, and then doing your very best to affirm that their idea or their imagination or their version of this world, in at least some senses, is both accurate and acceptable. And if you're able to do that, if you're able to do the research necessary to know the world, understand that this is a game you're playing alongside the players themselves, you're weaving this puzzle, this narrative together, if you're able to create modules that allow you to adjust and reposition pieces as players are moving down the board, picking up puzzle pieces and laying them down in a pattern that makes it feel like they're not on rails, but like they still have a purpose or in a direction that they're going down. If you're able to keep the world moving and changing around them, make them exist within a space that is both living and active and has consequences to the choices that they make. And then finally, if you're able to listen and adapt to the players who are sitting around the table with you, not only hearing what they're passionate about, what they're excited for, but then also taking the time to understand the narrative roots, the storytelling roots that they want to explore, you will find that your ability to tell a story that interests and captivates and brings people into the fold will be very strengthened. I think that was a bad phrase, but that's kind of the main point. These are the things that I think about when prepping or trying to create a space that allows players to exist in. And I don't know if any of them are crazy innovative or if any of them even made that much sense to you. But this is what I'm doing. As I'm playing the game alongside my group, I am thinking through and visualizing and seeing this sort of map, this puzzle in front of me. And I'm trying to listen and add and adapt those pieces as the players explore and progress through this story. And to do so, I need to know what I'm talking about. I need to know the world and the lore we live in, and I most of all need to be able to hear and adjust based off of what the other people playing this game are doing. And at the end of the day, that is exactly what it is. Like I said at the very beginning, this is a game, a collaborative storytelling experience, and you have to treat it as such. As a DM, you are facilitating the environment within which people are playing. This is not your game. It is fun to tell a story, right? That is a lot of fun, but it is no fun to be told the story that you're playing. It is no fun to be forced down a narrative. People came to play a game. They didn't come to hear your great tale that you've perfectly written. And so I don't sit down and write a book. Instead, I write options. I write ideas. I create characters that could or couldn't exist, people that they may never come in contact with. But I know they still exist in this world. This is still a functioning, living society, and so I have a sense of where all those pieces are. I think that's enough, though. I'm not sure if this is a good video. I really am not. I really just took some bullet points on things that I think of when I am making and telling a story, and I thought I'd talk about them for a while. I don't know if that results in a good, interesting video or not. If you made it to this point, I suppose it did. I'd love it if you'd let me know, and you'd let me know what other things you'd like to hear me develop and talk about. I'm thinking about doing a setup for a game 0. So how you start and and begin kind of the D&D experience, or set the stage for a healthy storytelling environment. Yeah, I'm just experimenting. I also want to figure out how to bring RPG games and storytelling games to the channel more. I honestly haven't figured it out yet, but I will get there. Whatever the case, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's been beneficial. If you're watching this today, when it went up, swing over by the Deck of Many Animated Spells. There's a link down in the description below. They are incredible. And if you're interested in getting them, or you think your group would benefit from them, you will not be disappointed. That being said, if you're watching this post, they have all of these, or at least the vast majority of these, available on their website. And so swing over to the Deck of Many and check out all the different products they have and they host. Whatever you do, though, remember to do the important thing. Get out and play some games. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.